Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. And I am once more joined by my French counterpart, Andrew Houck from Poitiers today. He was unable to attend last time we were intending to do this um, interview conversation, but now he is here, and that's why we did a second part so that he could A, meet the author, and B, get a great conversation in with him. And technically, at time of recording, this first part has not aired yet, but it will air shortly. And the part here is just before Thanksgiving to air. So this is kind of a beautiful Labor Day to Thanksgiving art we're pulling. And our author is, of course, the illustrious Benjamin Railton from Fitchburg State University in Massachusetts, where he is a professor in English studies and also doing American studies. PhD from Temple University. A lot of books published. You probably can just listen to the introduction of the first video to get a sense of it. And of course, today we are talking about Of Thee I Sing, The Contested History of American Patriotism, from Bloomsbury Press, and apparently reduced in price as of right now. Instead of 40, you can get it for 28 from the press.
Get out there, people.
Buy it. It's a great Thanksgiving purchase for a holiday gift. So, since I jabbed all the time last time was Ben, Andrew gets to jab a lot more today. So, Andrew, your first stab
Well,
at it.
hi. So I'm hoping that I'm not going to my questions and conversation topics aren't going to be an overlap with what we did last time. We guys did last time. Um, if
Always happy to talk more. It's all good.
so. So hi. Yeah. I'm glad we were able to do this because I was very disappointed last time when I couldn't join you guys. And so Niels, thanks for suggesting it. Ben, thanks for joining us again. Yeah, it's a good time. So yeah, I mean, we've followed each other for a long time on social media, and I've read a lot of your blog posts and a lot of your weekly links with all your goings on, and yeah, it's great to finally meet you. Virtually, of course.
Yeah, you too.
So great book. It feels like it's building on your earlier work, and I am sad to say that I haven't read anything book-wise of yours before. Of the I Sing, it's been out since what, 2020 or 2021?
2021, early 21. Yeah.
So lots of stuff has changed. Oof. Um, so it
Has
was building
it? I mean, has it really changed that much?
I don't know. Okay, so you talk about four forms of patriotism in your book. Can you talk about those a little bit? Like how do you define these types of what does patriotism in the United States look like? What's a good
Ab-
definition of patriotism?
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I'm really glad to be talking to you both again and to you, Andrew, today. And I hope that it'll complement that first conversation and keep building on it and adding new directions. And yeah, the origin point for this project, which was something that Niels and I talked a little bit about, but I'm sure I'll say it in different ways today because it's always evolving, was the idea that when we use a term like patriotism, and I would say the same even about America and American identity as terms and concepts, and I know we might circle back to those, that when we use these terms, we often sort of act as if we all kind of mean the same thing and or even kind of know what we mean or have an assumption about what we mean. And really the origin point for this project was my sense that that is not the case, that there have been these different forms that have been contested and sort of conflicted and contradictory and in relationship to each other throughout our history, and then maybe even more clearly into the present moment. I was working on this book in 2020 or so, and then came out in early 21. So the starting point in some ways was one definition, which is the one I think that we often do kind of mean when we use it as shorthand, which is the one I call celebratory patriotism. And that's the type that is about performances, rituals, kind of rote moments of a national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, 4th of July fireworks, these moments of kind of celebrating this shared thing that is the nation, this community, this place, this history, people, figures, all the different things that we might celebrate. And of course, that gets complicated as well. But that idea of a celebration, of a shared celebration of the nation, is a kind of default, I think, a lot of the time when we talk about patriotism. And then pretty early in my thinking about it, I realized that part of my issue with that form is not itself necessarily. Niels and I talked last time about the problems with something like nationalism, which I certainly agree with. But I think celebratory patriotism can be a real positive for a community if we can find ways to sort of inclusively share a sense of pride and love for the community that we share, that we're part of. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I think very, very frequently in American history, anyway, celebratory has morphed into a second type, which is the type I call mythic patriotism. And that's the type that really is much more exclusionary than inclusive in a couple different ways, I argue. One is that it often excludes a lot from what is being celebrated, leaves out a lot of histories, a lot of communities, a lot of figures, a lot of stories. And then secondly, and maybe even more destructively, says, if you don't agree with what's being celebrated in this particular way, you're not a patriot and maybe not even an American. So it excludes from what's being celebrated, but it also excludes sort of who can be part of it, in my argument. So that's the mythic type. And then really the third and fourth were ones that I wanted to pose as more inclusive and inspiring alternatives to that type. Particularly the fourth one, which is really the heart of the book, I think ultimately is the relationship between mythic and what I call critical patriotism, which is the type that says, no, in fact, the best way to be patriotic is to be critical of the nation, is to highlight its shortcomings, its flaws, its failures, and then try to push closer to our ideals, to the best of us. And I really see that as pretty directly contrasting with the mythic patriotic vision and narrative. And then the fourth type is just because I also think another potential problem with celebratory is that it can be very passive. It doesn't ask us to do a lot other than to just kind of like go along with the celebrations. And so I wanted to suggest the idea of active patriotism to highlight the idea of service and sacrifice, also attempting to push the nation closer to its ideals. So kind of parallel to critical patriotism, but with a real emphasis on that idea of active patriotism through things like protests or various forms of creation, or even say like the United States colored troops during the Civil War. I think that's an incredible example of active patriotism, of service and sacrifice, trying to push the nation closer to its ideals. So started with this idea that what we talk about when we talk about patriotism is often assumed to be one thing. I think that one thing itself can be problematic because it can turn into that mythic patriotic type, but then it also just leaves out these other possibilities that I think have really been present and important throughout our history as well.
Well, and you talked about you mentioned nationalism, and I think a lot of people, there's a lot of room for conflating patriotism and nationalism. So go ahead, man.
Yeah. So and I think the mythic patriotic form definitely gets pretty close to how I would define nationalism in that idea of exclusion in particular. Because to me,
Yeah,
the real
well,
go ahead.
we're not talking about 19th century nationalism like Niels, your book,
Right.
the idea of a
Oh,
nation and nation state building and national identity. We're talking about nationalism as an exclusionary.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think um again that there's always that possibility for slippage, right? That when we are defining that we, and my prior book, which was really kind of complementary to Of the Ice saying it's in the same American Ways series, is called We the People, the 500-year battle over who is American. So it's about these questions of how we define American identity in America. And I do think that when we're creating that we, that national we, it is very easy to do it by creating thems, right? By creating those who are outside of that we. And to me, that's really what nationalism is. It's this kind of chauvinistic thing that says there's a definite we, it's in opposition to these thems, and it's better than those thems, right? A lot of the time, which is obviously another level problematic, I would say. So I don't think nationalism or national identity has to go there. I think there's various possibilities for that too. But I do think there is a real easy slippage into chauvinistic, us versus them, exclusionary narratives of the nation, creations of the we. And I think that and mythic patriotism really have a lot in common. They're really parallel to each other.
Niels, do you have anything to say about
No,
that?
I mean, that's something that I always find fascinating, right? We, of course, especially when you look at the news right now, and it's like this feel of like, oh, because you're brown skinned or you speak Spanish, you're not part of us, right? And you have this, even though they are, right? There's so many instances right now where it's like ICE goes in and arrests a US citizen because a person looks brown, looks Hispanic, looks Latin, looks different. And it it's it's sadly so much of the American story is about this like othering oftentimes.
And not just that they are in the present, but a real central emphasis of both We the People and
Hmm.
of the I Sing for Me is that these different options have always been with us, right?
Yeah.
It's one of my couple most like career long things I try to make the case for is that these
Hmm.
diverse, multi-layered, have never not been a part of the American story. And indeed, one of the main problems with mythic patriotism to me in the United States, and certainly right now in the United States, is that it relies on this homogeneous vision, right?
Hmm.
That America has ever been, English speaking or white or Christian or Euro or Anglo, what as if we haven't always had all of these
Hmm.
possibilities. And so I do think again that's part of our story is the foundational exclusionary vision, but equally part of the story are the foundational alternatives to that, alternative definitions, alternative patriotisms. And we were talking right before we recorded about how pessimistic it's easy to feel right now or how depressed. But again, we've always had these multiple possibilities, right? We've always had these conflicts. And so the question becomes how do we make the case for the more inclusive versions of these things?
Yeah. Maybe think about the Mexican cession and after the Mexican War. I mean, you've got I don't know how many tens of thousands of Spanish-speaking Mexicans in that area who were whose citizenship was denied just because they spoke Spanish, just because they were formerly Mexican.
Yeah, even though, on my understanding anyway, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is that the opposite was promised.
Yeah,
They
they
were
were supposed to be
promised,
promised. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Article
that they would
10.
be, yeah, fully part of the new expanding United States.
Yeah.
And then in practice, you get things like squatting,
Mhm.
by arriving settlers, and that gets a lot of support from the new governments, the courts,
Mhm.
again, explicitly because of that narrative, right? Because of
Yeah,
this idea that the squatters are more American in that vision
yeah.
than those existing Mexican American
Well, and then
communities.
taking their land that had been theirs for
Yep.
generations, and coming
Yep.
in with slaves as well. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Well, but I
And so,
mean, as we're talking there, I'm also kind of reminded of, and I think you have it in the book as well, like Japanese Exclusion Act, right? Not the Japanese internment,
mhm.
and just the because Japan, the country, attacks all Japanese people in the United States, even though they're born, they're naturalized citizens, are evil bad guys, and it like I just saw that apparently they're creating an ice facility at a place where a former
Yes, they are.
internment camp was located. And it's like,
Really, what? I didn't see
Yeah,
that.
yeah, at Fort
yeah,
Bliss in
yeah,
Texas.
Oh,
yeah.
And it's like I so remember like when during COVID when you were writing the book, I guess, or finishing up final touches for publication, I had a park ranger from Manzanar in my class, and she talked
Mm-hmm.
about how after 9/11, Japanese Americans went with Muslims into stores to kind of say, no, no, these were not the guys that attacked. They're not to be treated bad like we were when internment took place. It's like there is sort of a repetition almost of this like exclu of where we're all like your students probably all the time say, right, why study history, right? To avoid the repetition of it. But we always do
we're
it.
always repeating it.
It's like it's just we don't seem to learn from it because maybe because of this sort of patriotic misunderstanding of the past.
Well,
And go
well,
ahead,
I was
Andrew.
going to say the idea of freedom. I mean, the
Hmm.
patriotic, the mythic patriotic idea
Right.
of freedom. What is freedom, and how do you define it, and how do you apply it? And
And then I was going to say, I think another thing that I've thought more about in this last year or so, or 6, 7 months in particular, or so of this new administration and their emphasis on, erasing history, deleting history, limiting what is taught, what is remembered, what is in all our spaces and communities. I do think it's another problem with the celebratory patriotic narrative
Mhm.
that I didn't make as explicit in the book as maybe I should have, which is that it feels so much of the time that
Mhm.
celebrating means only the positive, right? That if
Right.
you're going to celebrate something, it has to just be the ideals, the things
Mhm.
like freedom or the like, rather than all the ways they have not yet been achieved, the ways we've fallen short, the moments, the histories, the stories when we have failed. And that's why I think critical patriotism is so important, is to say it's not either or. Being critical is not being just anti-celebratory. It in fact can be about celebrating those ideals by highlighting the failures and the shortcomings and trying to push us closer to them. I really think there's no more important work for us to do as American studies folks these days than to say being critical of the United States, highlighting our flaws and failings and worst histories is
Mhm.
patriotic. It is
yeah,
pushing us toward those ideals, because that really challenges this idea that you're either celebrating like this
Mhm.
administration claims they want to, or you're just critical. It is not that divided. And in fact, again, I think it's ultimately interconnected. Critical is patriotic. So
Mhm.
to me, that's really at the heart of what the book ultimately was trying to frame, is that duality between the mythic patriotic narrative that
Mhm.
says you're either with this or you're not us, and the
mhm,
critical patriotic narrative that says no. Challenging that is the most patriotic thing we can do, the most American,
Mhm.
in an ideal sense, thing we can do.
yeah.
Right.
You might need to make. It'd be interesting uh, to re-release the book with a new introduction and maybe an epilogue.
Hmm.
Maybe
Yeah.
in a few years, four
Yes,
or 5 years. Yeah.
if we're still allowed to publish at that time. Um, yeah, no, it has been really striking since We the People. I've made the case that both how we define American and how we think about our history are just at the heart of every one of these current debates too. And I just think that's becoming more and more explicitly clear and the case. And I do think, um, again, it's vital for all of us who do this work and who have any interest in being part of public conversations anyway, as I know the three of us do anyway,
Mm.
to add our voices into those conversations and not let it be dominated by these other visions of it.
Well, but again, Niels and I are in a pretty
Right.
privileged position because we're far away.
Yeah.
We're looking, from
Mhm.
Europe. So
It is a benefit every now and then. Even though I have to enter the country apparently in October, so I will be having to watch what I say more.
And actually, just to connect what we were just talking about also to the Civil War era and the way we remember that, which I know is a central thread of the work that you guys do in this podcast and in your work. One of the moments I was really struck by over the last couple of months was when J.D. Vance said, as part of some interview, that people who are descended from Confederate soldiers or people Confederate are more American than, say, any immigrant who comes to the US could ever be, right? So again, these definitions of America, and I'm not making the case that those who are descended from Confederates are not American. I'm not saying the opposite of him. But the fact that he's making that case, again, you kind of can see how mythic patriotism and these white supremacist exclusionary visions can create that kind of narrative, right? That even people connected to a moment when an entire nation tried to secede from the United States are by definition more American because of their skin color or their ethnicity or their heritage than anyone could ever be if they have come to the US from anywhere in the world. It's just such a striking illustration of how something like Confederate memory can also become part of these narratives, I think.
It is part of these narratives. I
Yeah.
mean,
It is. Yeah.
Well, speaking of that, it reminds me where he says that because, like, I mean, I've made the case a few times when people were kind of like, well, they're American, we should not take down their status. I'm like, by definition of what they did, they aren't American. They want to create a separate country. But it so reminded me, it's in one of the articles related to the Tenement Museum in New York, and I think it's a kitchen conversation where they talk about like the different groups of people that had apartments in the building, and one of them is the Baldizzi family, and I think they were from Sicily or something, southern Italy, which 1920s, I want to say, was post-quota. They could not
Mhm.
actually enter the country because the quota for Italy was full, so they couldn't come in. So what they did was through Canada, they
Mhm.
entered Canada and then took the route from Canada down to New York. And so technically are quote unquote illegal immigrants.
Yeah.
And the museum sort of in their writing were like it they felt really odd because people were kind of like, but they're good illegal immigrants because they're white,
Mhm.
Italian, and it sort of created this conversation of like, why do we think of the Mexican or the Hispanic or the Latin immigrant who comes across the border as an illegal quote unquote immigrant as bad, and these guys aren't, it's like it's I think feels it speaks to the sort of how do we create this patriotic
well,
identity of
well,
ours.
and then the flipping of the ethnicity from non-white to white, because
Right.
Mhm.
both Irish and Southern European,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when the switch happened, but for a long time weren't
Hmm.
considered as equals of, the people
Yeah.
of German extraction or Northern European extraction.
And I think one of the ways, just to put in a quick plug for the subject of the narrative history podcast that I created last fall, which was about the Chinese exclusion era and specifically about a baseball team, a really fascinating Chinese American
Mm.
baseball team in the 1870s, the
What's the
Celestials.
title?
The podcast is called The Celestials' Last Game: Baseball,
Mm.
Bigotry, and the Battle for America. It's about this 1870s baseball team of young Chinese American men from the Chinese Educational Mission
Mm.
in Hartford, Connecticut in the 1870s and early 1880s. And then the other main character in that podcast is Dennis Kearney, the Irish immigrant who became the kind of leading face of the anti-Chinese movement in the 1870s and then really helped create the moment for the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Kearney's a really great example because the way that he sort of becomes white is by making that argument, is by sort of aligning himself with that white supremacist
Mhm.
vision,
Mm.
where the Chinese are these foreign enemies, even Chinese
Mhm.
American communities. And Kearney is speaking for that kind of white supremacist America,
Mhm.
even though he's an immigrant. Just about 15 years before he's making that case, he comes to the US from Ireland. And so I think that's a really great example, again, of that process of buying into and kind of amplifying the mythic patriotism, the white supremacist definition of America, and so becoming more a part of that America.
Mhm.
Even though, again, Kearney came to the US at a time when Irish Americans were definitely still being targeted by prejudice and discrimination and exclusion. But he sort of makes his way into that white supremacist mythic patriotic narrative by advancing it toward Chinese Americans, by turning it toward this other community. And I think that's really a central thread of how these have been perpetuated, how these
Yeah.
exclusionary narratives have been, is by these other communities kind of adopting them toward other Americans, toward African Americans, Native
So
Americans, Chinese Americans, et cetera.
that reminds me of I don't know if it's going to have any, any teeth at all, but Elon Musk's American Party.
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
bringing us back to the Civil War era. I mean,
Yeah. The know nothings for sure. I would
yeah,
say they should just go with that title instead.
yeah. So I mean, could
Would fit.
he do the same thing via the American his
Yeah,
American Party that Kearney
yeah,
did with the anti
he did.
Chinese
Yeah.
activity?
So it is a bit weird when you think about it that here you have the South African immigrant who tries to
The
create.
African American immigrant.
Yeah.
Yes,
um,
African American. Oh
and I
gosh.
do, just to circle back to what you were saying, Niels, about like Confederate statues or Confederate memory.
Mm.
It's obviously a complicated question how we remember like that community and the
Mm,
Confederate States of America. I grew up in Virginia, in Charlottesville, in fact, so I've been
mm,
surrounded by these questions my whole life. And I personally would not want to make the case that the Confederates were not American. They tried, right? They
mm,
tried not to be, but luckily they failed. I'm really glad they failed as someone who grew up in Virginia, right? And obviously there were so many people in the South throughout that period who
mm,
didn't want to secede, who were not part of that cause. And so it's a complicated question, but it circles back again to this idea that because of white supremacy and mythic
mm,
patriotism, the Trump administration can want to put back up a portrait of Robert E. Lee
mm,
while they're taking down portraits of, African American histories or Asian American ones, right? That whiteness is the guarantee. Even if it's
mhm,
Confederate whiteness, it's the guarantee of Americanness in that vision compared to any other community,
mm,
whatever the histories might feature, right? And I just think it's such a striking thing that however we see the Confederate States, from that exclusionary perspective, they are infinitely more American because of that whiteness, the Confederate leaders and so on, than were, you know, any other American community at that time or since.
Hmm.
Well, and it fits even to them in their own time, right? They're thinking in terms of like we are the inheritors of the American Revolution and its
Right.
identity, and
Yeah.
therefore we are the true patriots.
Mm-hmm.
Because George Washington was the founding fathers were Virginian.
Yes.
um, yeah, that was one of the hardest chapters in of the I Sing for me to kind of conceptualize was the Civil War one.
Mm,
Um, for lots of reasons, but that's one of them is that, yeah, the Confederate, in almost every one of those like secession statements or the
mhm,
cornerstone speech, et cetera, they're making that case, right? They're saying,
right.
we are the revolutionary patriots, we are the
Mm,
inheritors. And I do think that's a really pretty classic example,
mm,
even though they're pretending that they're separating from the US, of mythic patriotism, of American mythic patriotism, right? Of still saying we embody the ideals. And I think that's a really striking moment to recognize that, and again the role that white supremacy can play in that vision of America's identity and American ideals.
It might be a different topic of discussion, but as an American studier, the 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 adjective, the demonym American, is problematic in of itself, and I don't know the origin. Why is it United Statesian?
Right. I think just because that sounds so bad.
It does.
Yeah,
It works in other languages.
it does. See, and I try really hard when and how I can. I don't pretend to be a hemispheric scholar. Although my minor in college was Latin American history and literature, and I've always tried to keep it in mind in one way or another. I do think there's real value in hemispheric thinking about these questions and hemispheric histories and thinking beyond the borders, and that itself then makes clear that we need to complicate. I agree the use of American in that particular way. I think it is a shorthand that at times is just inevitable because USian is just so hard to say and looks weird on the page. I guess we could get there eventually if we pushed it hard enough. But I would say the more important thing is precisely the recognition of the hemispheric questions, right, and the recognition of trying to put the U.S. in conversation with other
mm,
places, even when it comes to these competing visions of patriotism, right? These competing histories, looking at Brazil's current sort of battle with a dictator like
mhm,
authoritarian leader who's trying to use a certain vision of the history of that place, even though it's so incredibly diverse and multi-ethnic, for example. So I'm a big advocate for trying to think in those hemispheric ways, especially just to circle back to the idea of other definitions of our identity. One of the ones that I think is the most important for me is the idea of a creolized history, the
mhm,
Edouard Glissant idea of the creolization and the making of the Americas.
mm,
The United States has been a Creole nation from its jump, right? It has been a multi-ethnic, racial, lingual, um, all the things, a nation from its jump. And I think that Glissant idea about that as part of the history of the Americas overall
mm.
really has a lot to tell us about our history.
I think
So I
it's the first time.
absolutely
Well, it's the first time I've heard Edouard Glissant used to talk about the United States.
I absolutely think he should be. I really think, again, so much of the problem in our current moment stems from that idea that we ever were homogeneous, right? That we were not this thing that was so that was so mixed in the best ways and the worst ways, right? All the ways. And I just think it's just a fundamentally different starting point is to recognize that starting point of us. And I do think it's at the heart of both the American definitions I try to make the case for, the inclusive one, and of critical patriotism too, is saying in the best and worst ways, we have been that multi, that diverse, creolized place from the jump.
And then it becomes really problematic with in your chapter on the 60s and the love it or leave it.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that at some point. But I can't remember who said it. I don't want to get up and pull Hal from the shelf up there, but I want to say it was Daniel House. Well, what God has robbed, or because I want to say that Mexicans considered themselves in 1815 American, just like people in the United States considered themselves American. So it's a very contested kind of narrative, and um yeah, I don't know like how like I guess we could think of it like Andrew and I from a European perspective, and I think there is something to be said that there's something similar happening with sort of these celebratory contested patriotisms even here. Um but yeah, I kind of I don't know about South America that much of how that would be playing out in say Argentina or Peru.
It seems to me that there are more instances now, and you see it especially on
Mm,
comments on social media of someone, typically American audiences tend to think of themselves as the primary audience, so they'll
mm,
you misspelled that, or that's not the right word for something. There are other types of English in the world where they correct, learned as learned or what. But then you also see, or I see this anyway, more people talking about being American, and I'm American too. I'm from Brazil, or I'm
mm,
American too. I'm from Venezuela, or
right,
I'm American too. I'm from Canada.
right.
So you have more, I think, acknowledgement of, I think, the
Mm,
vagueness of the problematicness
mm,
of American as an adjective.
And also then again to flip it to a potentially inspiring inclusive idea, again that sort of
mhm,
transnational history of
Yeah,
the United States, right?
yeah.
And
yeah,
again, so much of mythic patriotism and exclusion depends on setting these clear borders and
mm,
boundaries, right? The literal ones and all the figurative ones. And so the more we can think about these crossages and
mm.
these combinations and these mixtures and these transformations that have always been ours, I just think the more it opens up alternatives and other ways to think.
Uh, just before I forget the question, one of the or comment rather, one of the things I really enjoyed about your book, you never use the passive voice.
Mm.
So in terms of perspective, there's no passive voice anywhere, I don't think.
If I have
I
nightmares tonight, Andrew, I'm gonna blame you.
on my the people who taught me writing would be happy to hear that. I'm sure that I know I do sometimes it just in my life, but I do think it's really important, yeah, to think about these as things that are being constructed, right? Well, that was passive. Sorry, that we construct, that Americans have constructed. Now you're going to have me thinking about it all the time too. But
Well, okay, so the reason I say that is because I was finishing a chapter for a book that I sent out for publication, or sent out to the team for public for to to I don't know, reread it,
The editors.
edit it, last week, and your book was fresh in my mind, and I was thinking, okay, so what would Ben Railton do? Da, 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 da.
well, I appreciate it, and I do. I mean, I do think it's important. Part of what happens a lot of the time with these histories and these narratives is that they're presented as a given, right? Or that they just sort of have happened to us. Um, Particularly, again, say the celebratory patriotism, the homogeneous vision of America, that we just sort of inherit them, right? That we just passively are given them. And seeing them as constructed also helps us see them as contested and having alternatives, right? So that the active role in these things. And again, you can't live in 2025 America, I don't think, and not recognize the active role that has to happen for these to be constructed, right? It isn't just a coincidence. They get built. They get built by exclusion and white supremacy and erasure and censorship and deportation, and right, they get built, these identities, these narratives, which also means they can be challenged, right? It means there can be alternatives.
Oftentimes it's a pendulum going back and forth.
It is. It is.
Well, that actually is a great lead over to, like, I looked over the talking points that I initially, like months ago, sent, like in July, sent to Ben. And one of the things when I was reading the book, and this relates to the American Revolution chapter, is a book that is even further back than the American Revolution, a book about 1688 in British history, by Stephen Pincus. And what he kind of suggests was kind of the way it leads to 1688 is that we have two contesting visions of the future of the country, right? Like you have the James II Catholic aligned with France vision, and then you have the William of Orange Protestant commercial empire allied with the Dutch kind of vision that contests, they clash, there's some fighting, and then one of them emerges victorious. And it very often in sort of the way you have the book structured, but the way it also always plays out, right? It's sort of like you have these two different patriotic visions of what the country, like in sort of visionary, ought to be, or in the mythic, we would like to be. And it seems like we always have sort of that clashing that happens. I'm not sure if there's always a good winner in that, but it's sort of like it's those clashes that are taking place at various times.
So it's a question of binaries then?
Yeah, kind of. I hate to be Hegel, but
dualities, I think, for sure. I think they often do also, like, obviously interconnect and interrelate and are found even in the same figures, the same moments, the same events. And so certainly, dualities. But one thing I also try to do, and this is really hard and it's never been harder than in 2025, is to say that the inclusive side of that coin, the critical patriotic side, the inclusive America side, has to ideally be about including all of that messiness, including the worst, right? So part of what makes it not just a duality is that the side that I want to argue for is trying to feature all of these histories and all of these ideas, and the exclusionary side is trying to leave a lot of it out, right? And so it is this idea of, like, the Confederate States side. I'm fine with there not being those statues in Charlottesville. I'm good with that. I did not mourn them when they went down. But that's part of the history of the South, right, is the Confederate States. So we certainly have to include it when we tell the story, right, and include it in the history, compared to those who want to exclude entirely, such large swaths of our history, like the Trump administration does. So part of the challenge for the inclusive side and the critical patriotic side is saying, how do we make all these things part of our stories and histories? So even though it's a duality, I think it's kind of purposefully unbalanced in that way, in the sense that those of us making the case for the inclusive critical patriotic side are trying to grapple with all of it. And those making the case for the exclusionary mythic patriotic side are trying to leave an awful lot out. That's at least partly how I would kind of frame that relationship, I think.
So just as you would have to, just as the George Floyd protests and everything are part of that story, so is January 6th.
Yeah. The first book talk I gave for Of Thee I Sing, which was before the book came out, was for this school in Chicago called the GCE Lab School. They had invited me. I forget how they found out about the book, but they invited me to talk. And it was the day after January 6th. It was January 7th, 2021, that I gave that book talk. And the principal of the school, when we got to the Q&A, he asked me directly, how do you reconcile the idea of active patriotism as something that you're making the case for with what just happened on January 6th, where those people,
fresh.
right? And it sure was. And it was a good question, because those folks obviously defined themselves as active patriots, right? That was the way they framed their own story. Um, and so, yes, we have to include it. We can't pretend that that didn't happen, that those folks aren't Americans, right? They are, they were, they continue to be. But I do think the follow up for me is that idea that active patriotism, as I want to define it, is pushing the nation closer to its ideals. And I'm not willing to give up the vision of the ideals that I want to make the case for. And I'm certainly not willing to cede it to folks like those, to fascist white supremacist forces. They have a vision of our ideals. So did like the Nazis in Madison Square Garden in 1939, right? They said, we are fighting for American ideals. They had a portrait of George Washington on the backdrop of their stage. But I'm not willing to cede it to them. To me, that's the essence of mythic patriotism, is what they're fighting for. So yes, they're active, they're fighting, but they're fighting for a vision of America that is exclusionary and white supremacist and violently targeting anyone different from themselves. And so I do think it's important that we say not just like that there's active fighting, but what is the fighting for? And what vision of America is it fighting for? And so I certainly would argue, and people would, could disagree, but I would argue that the summer of 2020 protests were fighting for that more inclusive vision. They were fighting for that ideal vision of the U.S. Sometimes, obviously, got out of hand with fire, property damage, et cetera, like messy, complicated life stuff. But they were fighting for that vision. They were pushing America toward that inclusive ideal. And I would say January 6th, they were fighting for the alternative vision. They were pushing America toward an exclusionary, white supremacist, fascist ideal. So I do think it matters kind of what vision of America is being fought for in how we think about these efforts and these contested histories.
So as you were talking, I was thinking about the military side of this, right? Of like, because the military is sort of the main fighting force for the United States, and throughout its history, like we could think of Native Americans who fought alongside Jackson during the War of 1812. We could think of African Americans who fight with the U.S. Army during the Civil War or the First World War or Second World War. Native Americans who fight in the Western campaigns, Japanese Americans who fight in the same, like on and on and on. Many times they're fighting for a country that treats them as subhuman beings with the hope that eventually they
Yeah,
will be part of this. And it's sort of like it's that future looking hope
it
of
is.
Well,
being
and then
included.
the non-citizens enlisting and then being arrested by ICE.
Yeah,
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 I
that's
mean,
the other
that's
part, right?
yeah. And I remember when We the People came out, a lot of my examples of inclusive America in that project are examples of soldiers of color in different cases, like the Japanese American soldiers during World War II or the US colored troops during the Civil War, et cetera, et cetera. And I got really good questions a lot of the time of, you know, how do you square that with, for example, the way that the US military has so frequently been used at home and abroad
Mm,
to advance exclusion and violence toward others in a variety of ways. And so again, that's one of those pivot points, right? That's one of those kind of complicated duality moments where at one and the same time, far too often our military has been in service of exclusionary white supremacist
mm,
visions of the United States at home and abroad. But at the same time, it has offered all Americans the opportunity to serve that ideal vision that they're fighting for. And I think a great example of that is putting in conversation like the way Douglas talked about the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War, and then the way that Du Bois talked about African American soldiers after World War One, right? That
mm,
they fought for democracy at home and abroad, right? That returning soldiers piece that Du Bois writes that's so powerful for the crisis right at the end of World War One. It's a fight, right? It's
mm,
not done. It's an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's a struggle in both cases. It's a struggle around the world, but it's equally a struggle here that those folks are fighting as part of. So I do think that's another one of those pivot points where it's both the worst and the best
mm,
of us in the same space, in the same community.
mm.
oh,
Keep going, Andrew.
I was gonna say, go ahead. Do you have something?
No, go ahead.
All right. Well, I'd like to go back, if we could, to talked about January 6th. It's parallels to the Civil War. So with the idea of American being critical, critical patriotism, active patriotism, you're using your own narrative to, you're going to the, you're taking your narrative and going all the way with it. Thinking about the Confederates, um, the, the the very fraught word treason. At what point does active patriotism end and say treason begin? Are you are you
Yeah,
Ooh.
going against the very ideals that the nation, as it were founded on? Was founded on?
it's a great question, and it gets particularly complicated, just to add another little monkey wrench into the mix, because a lot of the time the government of the United States has kind of been aligned with white supremacist exclusion,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So if you're opposed to the government for much of our history, and of course, I would say right now in 2025, you are certainly not necessarily treasonous in my book. In fact, I would say for a lot of our history and in the present, opposing our government is a way to really be critical patriotic and active patriotic and to push the nation closer to its ideals. I think part of it then comes down to how that active critical patriotism is expressed, right? I think, a violent assault on the US Capitol building is out of bounds to me, right? That is no longer active or critical patriotic. That is an insurrection of, violent attempt at a coup d'etat, right? Attempt at a violent overthrow, which even if I hope and I believe that even if that were happening like now with a motivation I might agree with, I would be entirely opposed to the action because I think that is not American ideals. That is not American identity in the way I want to define it. And so I do think there is a spectrum there, and that opposition can be very critical, patriotic, and active and inclusive, but violent insurrection to me is not. But then the follow up, certainly when it comes to the Civil War, again, is I think it was treasonous, not just because they were literally saying that they're separating from the US and taking shots at US forts and so on. I think it was treasonous because, Alexander Stevens said the cornerstone of our government is slavery and is the fact that, that white supremacy is the natural order of our new state, of our new government. To me, that was treasonous to the ideals of the United States. As much as we have fallen short of those ideals, they still are the inclusive ideals that I want to make the case for. So if you found a new government that is opposed to the US, that fights against the US, and that says the cornerstone of our government is slavery and white supremacy, then yes, I would say that is treasonous to the ideals of the US and needs to be opposed, needs to be challenged. So I think it is about the use of violence, but it's also about, again, critical and active patriotism to me is trying to push the nation closer to its inclusive ideals. That's the case I want to make. And if there are efforts that are trying to push the nation closer to exclusionary white supremacy, then that's something different. That's to me mythic patriotism. That's this other side of the coin.
Hmm.
Too complicated because as you were talking, I was thinking of the flip side of that coin, right? That like things like the Palmer raids, where
Yeah,
it's like we're having or
yeah,
the activities against labor unions
yeah,
like Pullman
yeah,
strike and things of that nature. And here you have the US government going after individuals who are striking for better working
yeah,
conditions, who are not in any shape or form trying to challenge the US government. They just want a better life.
yeah, yeah.
But in the case of the Palmer raids, for example, they're just being labeled, oh, you're Bolsheviks, you're bad, and that's why we throw you out. Same like HUAC, the Red Scares, and even still today, right? It's this like what Marjorie Taylor Greene has built her early political career on like labeling everyone as socialist,
Mm-hmm.
not never telling us what that actually means. Um,
Hmm.
and it's sort of the bad word that you're not patriotic.
And and I do think again, putting these two projects of mine, We the People and Of Thee I Sing, in relationship, all of those efforts, or all the ones that you just mentioned for sure, depend on these definitions, right? Depend
Mm.
on an exclusionary, white supremacist, mythic, patriotic. In my book on the in my chapter on the early 20th century and of the I Sing, I talk about that American plan, right? That
Mm.
corporations developed in the 1920s to target unions and target labor activists and target workers. There's a reason they called it the American plan, right? They were relying on that idea of mythic patriotism to say, we are the Americans, and those labor activists and unions and workers are outside of that. They're not American. Or House Un-American Activities Committee, right?
Mm.
There's this explicit use of those terms and those definitions to attack activists, critical patriots, as un-American, as outside of America. Um, and so I think absolutely the more we learn these histories, the more we see those moments as expressions of what mythic patriotism can do, of how it can explicitly lead to these attacks and these targetings of American communities as outside of America.
It's really interesting because all these topics, Niels, you talked about Marjorie Taylor Greene, we've talked about January 6th, and we've talked about the early 20s or the early 20th century, 1920s, 50s with McCarthy. It all ties in as well to the Civil War. I mean, it's all these threads come together as well during that 4-year kind of defining moment in American history. So yeah, I mean, this is the War of the Rebellion podcast,
Right.
and we're talking about all sorts of stuff. Even 2025.
Who cares?
The future, but it's all any way you look at this, you have parallels in the Civil War era or Reconstruction, of course.
So
And particularly, go ahead,
go
Niels.
ahead. I was going to throw in that I think we also need to talk about religion a little bit because it is a very important part of, especially nowadays, the evangelical right having accumulated so much power and crafted this other patriotic narrative of like, oh, United States is a Christian nation. Boom. Never was, but we're just going to search for evidence and try to piece us together.
Well, I thought, yeah, rereading my notes from the book a little while ago, the "In God We Trust" on the money,
Yeah.
1861.
Yeah.
I thought it was a lot later.
Right. No,
No,
I learned that while thinking
it will
about that
chase.
chapter. Yeah, that minister writes in and pushes the Treasury Department to do it. But the other thing I would say about religion when it comes to, say, active patriotism and critical patriotism, I just finished recently the great David Blight biography of Frederick Douglass, for example, and the way that Douglass used religion and his vision of America's ideals, the Declaration, the Constitution, et cetera, to make his case, right, for abolition, for equality, for Reconstruction, et cetera, or the way Lincoln does that during the Civil War, right, the way he uses religion and American ideals, even in something as short as the Gettysburg Address, to make the case for that more inclusive possible future of the United States that we're fighting for, that is the cause being fought and died for. I think the other thing the Civil War does for me is it reminds us again that none of these territories have to be ceded over to the exclusionary white supremacist forces, right? That religion doesn't, that American ideals don't, the flag doesn't, the military doesn't, right? That they all can potentially be in service of those ideals. And it doesn't mean that it's clean, doesn't mean, that Lincoln was one thing or that the Union cause was just one thing. But at the end of the day, I really think the Civil War epitomizes to me the possibility of all of those different kinds of ideals, religious ones, American ones, human ones, being marshaled in service of that the best of us, and in opposition to so much of the worst of us. And again, growing up in Virginia, all we ever were taught was that the South was just that one cause during that time, but it was not, right? There were Unionists. There were obviously all of the African-American Southerners. There were the fusion parties during Reconstruction and, General Longstreet becoming a leader of fusion parties after the Civil War, right? Like at every moment, you've got multiple Americans who are fighting for those ideals and for the best of us, even in the Confederate States and the former Confederate States. And so I just think it's always been that contest, and the contest has featured so many forces fighting for the best version. And I think the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, to me, really epitomize that, especially because I was just taught the opposite as a kid, right? I was taught that it was just these two possibilities. And instead, we see the fight. We see the fight everywhere in those times and places. And so I think that's been something I just recently was thinking about Longstreet because I wrote a piece for my Saturday Evening Post column on Lee versus Longstreet and collective memory. And I think it's really telling that Lee is the one who got embraced, right? Because he could really more easily embody that white supremacist vision. But Longstreet is the one who really interestingly embodies the fusion kind of vision, the becoming part of the fight for inclusion instead, before his life was. Yeah, completely. And I love that. I love that story. And I think if we tell that story, it gets harder than to just think about it as one thing or the other, right? It's either just this absolute or the other. No, you've got somebody like Longstreet who comes to fight for those inclusive ideals. And that too is
and he leads black troops.
Yeah, absolutely. In opposition to white supremacy, in opposition to Reconstruction era mythic patriotism. That's an American story that, if we remember, again, it just gets harder to see these as just these absolute binary oppositions. This has always been the mix of us, and we can always keep thinking about the best as part of it rather than just as an alternative.
Okay, so you grew up in Virginia.
Yeah.
You said in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
Question about what you learned in school. I mean, besides...
We should ask when, roughly, too, first.
I was born in 1977, so I was in elementary school in the 1980s and to high school in the 1990s. Yeah.
So what did you learn about West Virginia?
Right. There you go. Exactly what I'm talking about. I would say nothing other than that they were the butt of all of our jokes as kids, right? The only real image I had of West Virginia growing up in Virginia was the hillbilly butt of the jokes, right? The, incest and like extreme hillbilly communities, that sort of narrative, of West Virginia as the most backwards place. And so I can't remember when I first learned, it was probably college, when I first learned that, in fact, it exists as a state because they were better than us in Virginia, right? Because they were, at least in that core moment, not willing to join that effort, not willing to be part of that.
They were anti-Confederate.
Yeah, it blew my mind. And I honestly think those things are related, that part of the reason Virginia developed those jokes was to try to flip that script and say, no, we're better than them. They're inferior to us, rather than that historical reality of how that place came to be and how it came to be created. I was
going to say, then you drive through West Virginia and you see the Confederate flags.
Yes. Yep. And I think obviously there's lots of levels to that, but one of them is that we don't remember that history well, right? Yeah. That if in Virginia, for example, we were forced to grapple with what that moment meant and why there's a West Virginia, it sure would change the way we think about those two places and that dynamic. And no, I didn't learn any of that, at least not in the 80s and 90s. I don't know how it's currently taught, but it's another one of those examples like Longstreet, where these things are messy and they're multi-part, but they feature the better angels of our nature, to use another Civil War phrase, as well as the worst ones. And I love now that I know that, and I love that I can try to make that case for West Virginia.
So I learned it when I was college, I guess. And looking back at my U.S. history class in 11th grade, the textbook, there was the map of the United States with the dates of each of the states. 1863 for West Virginia, and I never wondered about why 1863.
Yeah,
of course it was not in the textbook. Of course, you learn about it.
And it doesn't fit
in Indiana. I'm from Indiana.
Right. And it doesn't fit those narratives as easily, right? Of West Virginia, or of the monolith of kind of the South, or the white South, or the Confederacy, however we want to frame it. I think it's so, again, I've said it multiple times today, but it's so telling that our current administration wants to limit so much what we are taught and learn, right? Because these narratives depend on us knowing practically nothing about the realities of our histories and our communities and our stories. And when we learn all those realities, it features the worst, but it features all these other things too. And it allows us to then grapple with all of that. So to me, mythic patriotism, the reason I use the term mythic, it's not even about remembering a certain history. It's about those myths, right? It's about creating and perpetuating those myths. And if we push back on them, it just opens up so much more.
Yeah, because demythifying history is really opening a can of worms that you're not necessarily prepared to deal with.
Yeah. But I will say, having worked with kids my whole life and also had my own sons grow up, I think kids are. I think they can take it. I think it's the adults
Yeah, I
who
was
are
going to say
really not
us.
prepared. Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
because
exactly.
we're not as
Yep.
malleable, or not as
Yeah.
not malleable is not the right word, but
Right. But
flexible.
I think Niels and I talked a little in the prior conversation about my experience teaching in adult learning programs, lifelong learning. I've had the chance to
Yeah.
teach a bunch of those over my career. And these are mostly folks who are, 65 and older, retired and older. And they're malleable too, and they want to be, right? I think the Trumpers of the world have this very frightened, narrow worldview, and they think it's widely shared, or they think that if it gets challenged, it hurts kids, or it hurts adults, or it hurts patriotism, right? There's these fears. In my experience, the opposite is true. In my experience, most folks, young, old, in between, are ready and able and willing to learn the hardest stuff and grapple with it and come out thinking about the best stuff too. So
Yeah.
I think those fears are reflective of the people who express them, but to me they're not reflective of the whole of us, and I have to keep believing that to stay sane
So
in
this
the
is your
fall.
optimism that we were talking about at the beginning of the
Yeah,
conversation.
this is my congenital optimism, but again, it's based on my experiences of every kind of teaching and classroom and community. um, and so I just have to keep believing that. And I know, for example, that a significant percentage of the folks that I want to be optimistic about probably voted for Trump in the fall of 2024. The numbers mean that had to happen. But I believe a lot of them, again, it's a matter of continuing to learn and talk about these things and share them together. And there is, one population that are already so deeply into the white supremacist exclusionary narrative and vision. Okay. But I think for a lot of us, it's about grappling more with these things together. And I think if we do that, it can come to a place where we all can be critical patriots in the best sense, or at least the vast majority of us can be. And that's the kind of fight I'm trying for anyway.
As opposed to cleaving the country
Yeah.
into
Yeah, that would
not
be
the
the
country,
other
but
option.
the nation, not the country.
Right. That would be the other option. And I'm not, I don't know as much about the Civil War as you guys, but I did grow up in Virginia, a Civil War buff, and I do not want another one. That's for damn sure.
Amen to that. My turn again, or you're still on a roll, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I've got tons of questions written down.
Oh, I know. You
Well,
always do.
well, it's always the ones that aren't written down that come in as zingers. But you talked about this a little while ago. Actually, parallel to it, and then you mentioned it, Lincoln. The use of Lincoln as shorthand for all these different types of patriotisms, and how Lincoln has the idea of Lincoln being shorthand has morphed over the last 160 years. I was thinking about that with the GOP of today, party of Trump, MAGA, still calling itself the party of Lincoln. And I have trouble reconciling that. I think a lot of people do in terms of patriotism. I mean, do you have any thoughts? Have you thought about that at all?
I have, and one of my favorite things about Lincoln, but also to me one of the greatest tragedies of American history, is how much he evolved, right? How much his arc changed when it came to thinking about things like a definition of America, right? And people like Frederick Douglass played a significant role in that evolution and that arc, even in a short time, from what I have seen and understood anyway. I think Lincoln always really believed in the ideals of America, but for a long time, he felt that only white Americans could kind of fully be connected to them, and believed in things like colonization, for example, as what seemed to be a fair response to African Americans not being able to fully connect to the ideals of America, or say Native Americans when it came to like that Minnesota, rebellion and the way that Lincoln responded to that. But I think as he evolved, and certainly right up to the end, when you see him, giving his last speeches about things like voting rights, and
That's a
obviously his
huge evolution. And
huge evolution, and it's so tragic that we don't get to see the next 20 years of Lincoln, in that Reconstruction and after period, or what that even would have looked like, obviously, if he'd been able to be part of it rather than Andrew freaking Johnson, and who I used to say was the worst president in American history. I'm not,
yeah, no.
he's in the short list anyway, and so I think Lincoln, to me, that's the story of Lincoln that is most inspiring, is someone who I think believed in our ideals, from a very young age, in his political career anyway, and his legal career, but came to see the inclusive possibility, so much more fully in those last years through experiences with people like Douglas and the U.S. colored troops, and the fight for the 13th Amendment, and so on.
And Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, and in contrast with what he saw of that second vice president that he unfortunately, maybe rightly, felt that he had to choose to win in 1864. Yeah, and Andrew Johnson. And so I just think like that story, which again is not the story of Lincoln that I was taught, where it's either like the just pure hero
The
or
Emancipator.
whatever. Yeah, yeah. Which, it's all in there. But to me, that evolution, that arc, that's really an American one. And it's not unlike Longstreet's, right? It's not unlike so much of our history where it is messy and it is multi-part.
Oh, like
But we can,
Ben Butler. I was thinking about him as well.
yeah, Ben Butler. And
Remind me.
he was a Civil War general who was at least partly a white supremacist early in his career, I
Yeah,
believe.
it was a Democrat
Yeah,
pre-war. I think he voted for Breckinridge
he did. Yeah.
in
And then
60.
ends up leading the Reconstruction effort in New
Yeah,
Orleans.
and flips to radical Republican,
Yep.
and helps workers and
Mm-hmm.
for voting rights, for universal voting rights, women,
Mm-hmm.
everybody.
Yeah. So that's the Lincoln that I'm most interested in. And again, I saw him as well in that Blight biography of Douglas as well, just that relationship and that ongoing development. And
American Oracle, right?
it's just called Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom is the Blight bio. Maybe he wrote a short one as well, but this is the
Mine's
super
Eric
big
Foreman.
800 page. Yeah, yeah, that's a good one too. But yeah, like I think that Lincoln has so much to tell us about the way that we can all keep evolving, right? And the way that the nation can keep evolving, that it's not black and white, and it's not either just celebratory or the worst. It's about that continued evolution toward something. And of course, the periods of intense regression, like the one that followed Lincoln's assassination, for sure, in a lot of ways. But that all of that's part of the story. And so I love that vision of him, and I love that way of thinking about, again, someone whose voice and whose ideas were so consistently in service of the ideals, but whose kind of life and perspective shifted more toward the inclusive version of it.
So then how can we reconcile that with Trump and it is the Republican Party of today? It's not the Republican Party of old. No, that's definitely not the case. But can they legitimately call themselves the party of Lincoln?
I mean, this is a deeper rabbit hole than.
Sorry for the question.
We're not going to fully go down this rabbit hole, I'm sure, but to me, it's not even a political party right now, right? It's a cult. It's a cult led by a figure who embodies all of our worst. To me, every time I think about like any of the worst of American history and identity, I see pieces of it in Trump and MAGA, right? It just embodies all of it all the time, so fully and so powerfully. And so no, I think, and I'm not saying this about every person in that party or every voter, but the leadership of it, the MAGA narrative, the Trump side of it, to me is a, a fascist, white supremacist, exclusionary cult embodying the worst of us. And so I think that's the opposite of the ideals that Lincoln fought for and of the evolution that Lincoln was able to show and kind of illustrate. Um, Trump individually seems to be someone who's just gotten deeper and deeper into that as he's gotten older, right? Who's gotten worse and worse when it comes to all of these narratives. And the party has followed him, it seems. And right now, the nation has followed him, it seems. And so I think it's the opposite, not only of Lincoln's ideals, but again, of that idea of an arc, of an evolution, of growth. It embodies the regression, right? The regression into the worst of us and toward worse than we've ever been in some ways, right? Like moving us not only backward, but further into our anti ideals, the kind of worst of us. So, no, I think it's the exact opposite.
So then the idea of American, where, I mean, if it's still on the pendulum,
right,
and you've gone back past what is physically possible to the laws of Lincoln,
yes,
Newton's laws,
yes,
it will be part of it. This is all part of the American. This will be part of American history, part of history of the nation. I don't know exactly where I was going to go with that question because it's going to be a difficult question to even consider. But the idea of American, of being American, and putting that together with the MAGA group, I find it very hard, according to your definitions of the types of patriotism, to find a place for MAGA really within any of those, because even the mythic patriotism is out of the scope, or rather, MAGA's version of American patriotism is beyond the scope of even the furthest reaches of mythic patriotism.
Yeah, that's why I'm very willing, as I just did a second ago, to use a word like fascism. I do think it has abandoned this version. I think this version especially. I think the one from the first Trump administration, I would call mythic patriotism in a lot of cases and ways, but I think this version, 2025 version, to me is full on sort of fascist nationalism, that kind of that version of nationalism that I would call fascism as well. And so I do think I think you can see the way they're using the myths and kind of deepening and relying on the myths through things like the celebratory vision of education and the banning of books and but it has more right, all those little layers of it, but it has morphed big layers, but it has morphed into this even more explicit fascist version, which again, if you study our history as we all do, it's not new. It's there in Madison Square Garden in 1939, right? We have these, but to have a government, the federal government, leaning into that so fully, rather than just like that movement that created the Madison Square Garden rally or that created the Ku Klux Klan in 1915, the Second Klan. Now we've got the kind of government as that. So I don't think it's new, and I do think it aligns with how some of those groups have tried to use their version of mythic patriotism, whether it's the KKK or the Bund in 1939 or whoever. But to have the federal government doing it, to have the president doing it, to have like that is to me an uncharted territory when it comes to the spectrum of categories that I've been thinking about. Yeah.
I cede the floor.
Oh.
You.
Okay. Well, then
I think just to say something like 10 minutes or so, I have to be headed out, but we have a few more to talk.
Sorry for dominating the conversation.
Well, no, that actually makes it more complicated because I had two questions that I was thinking about.
Let's talk about both. Let's do both.
All right, we'll try. Well, I have to duct tape Andrews in a little bit. So the first thing I was thinking about, and I was intending to frame this as sort of like something easier than what Andrew just rabbit holed you into. Considering often when we kind of think of kind of patriotic symbols or nationalistic symbols, right? Thanksgiving is one of the big ones. And I think considering this will air really close to Thanksgiving, this is a great kind of topic. How much did you consider including the colonial period in the book because I'm especially thinking here like Thanksgiving or things like Plymouth Rock and things like Malcolm X came to mind where it's like him saying like, no,
Mm.
Plymouth Rock, we didn't land there. Land Rock was landed on us, I think was the
Mhm.
words he used. So it's sort of like the colonial period does swing into the kind of patriotic narratives of the United States too. So did you consider it?
I did, absolutely. And another speech that really pairs well with the Malcolm X one is the Native American
Hmm.
activist Frank Wamsuda, who coined the idea of a national day of mourning
Hmm.
as an alternative to Thanksgiving at a speech at Plymouth in like 1970 something, 71, maybe
Yeah.
72. Um, and so, yeah, things like Plymouth and the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving open up so richly to these conversations for sure. I did have multiple chapters on that period in We the People, and so I think I felt partly that there was a complement that could happen here, particularly when thinking about the United States, obviously as something being created explicitly in and after the Revolution. But absolutely, I think it's so the 1619 project, right? It's so
Hmm.
important to extend back and think about the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries
Hmm.
as part of these narratives, as part of these stories. And I try to talk about that and write about that as much as I can. And something like Plymouth and Thanksgiving are great examples
Hmm.
that, again, have the worst in them in various ways, for
Hmm.
sure. But also, what would it mean to include sorry, Wamsuda James was his name. I called him Frank Wamsuda. He was born Frank James, and then he went by Wamsuda James. That was the National Day of Mourning guy. What would it mean to include his speech, to include
Hmm.
Malcolm's perspective, to include somebody like Tisquantum, right?
Hmm.
Squanto, who had been a slave and who spoke English and
Hmm.
and his Native American language and Spanish because he had been in Europe, right? That transnational vision of America, right?
Hmm.
What would it mean to include him in the story more fully than just as he's been included in the past? So absolutely, I think those Thanksgiving, Plymouth, Pilgrim images open up really richly to these conversations for sure.
Yeah, I mean, when it includes the colonial period, you also have then things like, um, well, we need to cope with half of the North American region that becomes the United States is Spanish, right?
Yeah,
Huge chunks
yeah,
are French, and English is actually a very small
yeah,
section,
absolutely,
It's like it challenges sort of some of the predominant assumptions that we have about
for
the
sure.
United States. Uh,
It does.
But the other one I
Yeah.
remember you had I think Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett were in the book, and you have a
Hmm.
tiny bit on John Wayne and the spaghetti westerns. But I wondered, the American West is sort of a very big, or I should say in the 50s, 60s was a very big kind of this sort of self-reliant, independent, gun-toting cowboy who sort of like conquers the West. And it sort of creates images that have long-lasting impact. I mean, sheriffs in the West still wears a cowboy hat,
Right.
right? And the sort of like, well, I should have guns because people in the American West had guns. And
Mhm.
of course, the realities are very different to that. But I wonder how much sort of images perpetuated by Hollywood also sort of impacts the way we think of the country.
Yeah, and not just Hollywood, but popular culture, right? Because I
Mm,
think a really, which includes Hollywood, a really great example within the frames you were just nicely highlighting, Niels, would be the cowboy itself,
hmm.
right? The percentage of cowboys who were black,
Right.
right? The percentage of
Hmm.
cowboys who were multiracial and multi-ethnic is huge, but they
Hmm.
weren't on the page in the first like dime westerns or books like The Virginian. And then when it translates into film westerns and TV
Hmm.
westerns and so on, it's the white cowboys, it's the white west, the white wild west, etc. And
Hmm.
so absolutely then those images perpetuate that story of the West, for example, as white, as dominated by these white stories and figures and histories, which then leads to how it gets used in the present, right? And so, what would it mean to tell that story? And we've started to in various ways, for sure, of the multi-ethnic West, right? Of Black cowboys, of Mexican ranchers, of Native American communities, of Chinese arrivals, like the ones I highlighted a bit in that podcast, of all of these communities that were always part of that place, right? And and that then opens up a really different vision, even if we think about guns or law or land or whatever. It's a vision that includes all those communities and all those forces and those American stories. And so I think absolutely that's an example where pop culture, from the dime novels through the film and TV westerns and so on, did really help perpetuate that mythic patriotic kind of image of the white West, or at least of things like the cowboy and so on as white. And then all the non-whites are just the others and the adversaries, right? They're just like the Native Americans coming over the hill, right? Or they're the the exotic others rather than core to the story, right? Integral to the story. So I do think that's a place where it's really important to see pop culture's role and to see how pop culture can also then serve in challenging it, right? If we can tell other stories, if
So,
we can create.
not to mention that the Native Americans or Chinese Americans were often portrayed with, by white
Yeah,
actors.
yes, in yellow face or red face for sure. Yeah, no, that's another layer to it as well. And so I just like the West to me is a great linchpin. In my podcast, I had a whole sort of half episode about the history of California,
Mm,
which was like the most diverse place in the
mm,
U.S. when it enters the U.S. Right? It had these Chinese communities, Mexican communities, Black arrivals, Native American communities, but then immediately, as soon as California becomes a part of the U.S., you get
Boom.
laws like the Anti-Vagrancy Act or the
mm,
Foreign Miners Tax, right, which defines like Mexican miners as foreign, even though that
mhm,
community had been in California hundreds of years before the arrival of Anglo settlers, right? So immediately you've got the use of law
mm,
and these narratives to define white as American and all these other communities as not American. So
mm,
I think absolutely the West opens up all of these things. And the reason we can still see it even vaguely as white centered has been pop culture in a lot of ways, right?
mm,
So if we can challenge that, we can open up a lot of other
mm.
possible versions of the story.
So what would be the best movie that Hollywood should make, according to you, to kind of challenge this sort of mythic?
Or a Netflix miniseries.
Bingo, even better.
um, well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to say the baseball game that I talked about in the podcast is a great start because that's in San Francisco. It's a
Mm.
game that takes place in 1881 in San Francisco, where the Celestials, this semi-pro baseball team, who are founded in Connecticut, but then they are forced to leave the country in the Chinese exclusion era. So they play this last game in San
Mm,
Francisco in September 1881, and that's just a couple years after Dennis Kearney is giving his anti-Chinese speeches also in San Francisco, which is where he sort of developed his anti-Chinese rhetoric, in a place called the Sandlot. That was the part of town where Kearney gave his speeches, and so then you get a baseball game played on a sandlot. You get Kearney on the Sandlot. You get
mm,
like these incredibly explicitly duality histories of San Francisco, of California, of America, and then obviously in that miniseries you could fold in Native American communities. You could fold in Black cowboys in that new
mm,
California of the 1870s. You could fold in all these other communities to think about the myth of
mm,
California and the reality, the myth of America and the reality. I think a moment like that really opens up the dualities we've been talking about throughout these conversations, the patriotic dualities, the American dualities, the historical ones, the contemporary ones. So I
mm.
just like that's at the heart of the work I want to do. And again, that idea of like the worst and the best of us in
Boom. That's
one
a
moment.
Netflix pitch right there. Done.
All right, let's send this over. And you guys will help
I
fund it, I assume, right? You'll be my
Oh, of
financial
course.
backers. All
I'll leave that to the French rich guy.
right.
You make more than I do.
You have two incomes?
You can cut this podcast at this point if you want. We don't have
Nah, we need to have at least some banter in here.
for sure.
Otherwise,
For
that's
sure.
not.
Yeah, otherwise it's not us. Yeah.
No, it's
Right.
not. It's
Right.
not as fun as it could be.
Well, I've had a
Uh,
lot of fun. Thank you.
yeah. No. Since this was your baby in many ways, Andrew, I'll let you have the last questions
Oh no,
because you left
I'm
those.
I'm done with my questions. I think I've tormented you enough, and I've sent you down enough rabbit holes for one evening or
It's been
afternoon as
great.
maybe.
It's been
Uh,
great. Both of these conversations, just remind me of how much these things are resonating and how much we need to keep thinking about them. So I really love the chance to do that.
Well, then I get the last question. That goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, and I think that is very contemporary from your book to the current times and this podcast, because Love It or Leave It is on many of your pages. Andrew and I obviously opted for the Leave It option. Here was Love It option still in on some level, but it seems, and I've heard it. You heard these kind of sayings said to by people in the US on a number of occasions that they just say that and they don't think about like, well, if you're born in the US, you don't necessarily have an option here to leave. Where would you leave to, right? I could leave to Germany, but that's different. Um,
I
Andrew,
had the opportunity to
yeah, you
come to
kind of,
France.
yeah, but it not a lot of people have that opportunity or the wealth to actually accomplish that. And it seems a very simplistic way of approaching a problem, right? Of like sort of like, I guess we could bring Chris Noem in this, right? Oh, I don't like my dog, I shoot it. But maybe you should train it.
Yes, definitely not the only answer there. I've got to believe. Yeah, and I think even more important, and I've thought about this a lot with somebody like James Baldwin, who did leave the United States, right? Spent much of the last part of his life in France, in Paris, but at every moment was still fighting for the America that he wanted to fight for. Was writing for it, was acting for it, was fighting for it. So even if one chooses to leave, as of course is the human story in every country all the time, right? The options people have in their lives and in their stories, to immigrate, to emigrate, to move. I think the American ideals are what we're fighting for, right? And so, and the Baldwin quote that features love, that is the epigraph for my book. I love America more than any country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on criticizing her perpetually. I think that's the quote. It's pretty much the quote. I think he kept doing that. He kept loving America and he kept criticizing for his whole life.
Perpetually,
Um,
yep.
Thanks. And so I think that work is that work, and
Mhm.
everybody has to make the choices that make sense and work for them. And I will as I go forward, and everybody will.
Mhm.
But like Baldwin, I love the best of it, and I'm going to fight and challenge the worst of it from wherever I am. So I think that phrase is not only too simplistic, as you say, and as black and white as mythic patriotism usually is,
Mhm.
but it also just loses sight of that the love and the fighting for it is not about where we are. It's about that vision of it that we want to fight for.
Mhm. Final word, Andrew.
It's got me thinking about Sarkozy. Used it, added it
Oh,
as one of his slogans
Mm.
during his presidency. Um,
yeah.
Obviously, you have Brexit,
Mhm.
and you have all the different, derivatives of that, Frexit and all these things.
Mhm.
So, yeah, there are a lot of binaries in a world, or a lot of binaries that are presented in a world that's much more complicated and nuanced.
Mhm. We'd like to oversimplify for the sake of sort of thinking people are not able to understand the complexity.
Right.
And
It boils down to us and them. I mean, basic questions of Benedict Anderson. I mean,
right. Yeah.
And those of us who teach and who write, I think, are really consistently trying to do the opposite, right? To add the nuance and help all of us grapple with it, especially the students and peers and audiences and communities that we're part
Mhm.
of. So we are on the side of the angels on that one, I think.
mm,
Now that is a perfect finishing line for today. We're angels. All right. So if you are interested in the book, I'm gonna pull it up here in my hand instead of looking up on my computer, of Z. I Sing, The Contested History of American Patriotism.
it's got a
As I
great
said,
cover too. Just so you know,
yeah.
I can't see it very well from. Show yours, Niels. Yeah, it's better.
Yep,
Thank you.
it's very
And
beautiful, very much speaks to sort of the different realities and it's on sale,
Yeah.
at least
Ben,
at time of recording.
you should plug your other stuff too.
Sure.
Right.
Briefly, I appreciate it. The home of a lot of my work is my daily blog, American Studies, which is americanstudier.blogspot.com. Although probably by the time that this airs, my wife and I are working on a new public scholarly website, which is going to be called Black, White, and Red All Over, READ all over. So you can keep an eye for that as well. That's going to be a place we're going to host a lot of our public scholarship going forward. But those places are really like hubs of a lot of the work that I do on the blog, for the Saturday Evening Post, in my books, the Scholar Sunday threads that I try to share of great scholarly work from the week, public scholarly work. All of those different pieces, which right now are on the American Studier page in different ways, are going to ultimately be part of that Black, White, and Red All Over as well page, which is going to be about American studies and film history and other things. So keep an eye for that. But you can find me lots of places on the web, and wherever you find me, please reach out, folks. Keep all these conversations going.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Awesome.
It was really
Thank
a
you.
great conversation.
Thank you,
Thanks
guys.
for meeting us.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back.
Of course.